Good morning or good evening to you. I am not present to you physically, but I am present to you face to face due to complications we've had here today going into the night and my necessity to be some other place tomorrow morning in terms of some serious things. So now what we're going to do is we have two sessions. And I think as a general overview, one of the ideas that I would present to you right away is this, that we have to remember that this is history as well as literature. By that, I mean that the 2 Corinthians and Romans are written by Paul at this time during 57 to 58. Now, he had this affair, well, I shouldn't say that. Right? He's had this problem with the great Artemis, the goddess of the moon, the goddess of the hunt, and the goddess of fertility, and her extraordinary visage. And as she has an incredible amount of access to what is could be the feeding of a large group of children. On the Passover feast, they leave for Philippi, and they sail toward Troas, where they spend a week. Now, you know what that means. It means they cross over if you have a map in front of you, it might help, but they have a miracle takes place when a young man falls out a window as Paul talks through the night. So you see what happens here is they have a meeting. And during this meeting, by the way, they have the Eucharist, it seems. And but this gentleman, he's sitting on the windowsill, and he from the third story, and he falls backwards. And then he goes, and cracks his skull or whatever. So what Paul does is he lays on him. Now you say, well, why is that language used instead of saying that, give him artificial respiration or something? Because of the fact that this reminds us of Elijah and Elisha, both of whom did a very similar thing. And they're laid out on the body of a person who had died. And it's kind of like the breathing, which is the symbol of life, goes back from them to, so it's not just bending over somebody, it's actually kind of taking into all the energy that you have to breathe in and breathe out, and then breathe in and then breathe out. And this gives them the possibility of bringing them back to life. So they share the Eucharist, and now in the morning, they sail for this Assos. Now, this is one of the small towns, as there are many small towns there. One of the diagrams that we had from before just showed you all of the various places where Paul set his foot on land, and it was so numerous. So anyway, they have several stops to make. And so the boat that comes for him now picks him up. And he's somewhat afraid of saying goodbye to the people of Ephesus. That's my emphasis here, is that it's not like he does want to get to Jerusalem for the Pentecost, but he's thinking if he goes to Ephesus, this is going to be a terrible situation of loss. Such was their affection of the members of the church. So he had in mind a very fast journey to Jerusalem for Pentecost. And so after journeys on land and sea, the presbyteries of Ephesus came to Miletus, which is south of Ephesus. So this is a summary, remember, so we're going to read this more carefully when we do the annotation. And they want to bid farewell to their beloved brother Paul. His lengthy, poetic, heart-wrenching words brought the souls of those present to the apex of sorrow and an overwhelming feeling of loss. Paul says he will not see them again, and he was right. Imagine that for maybe someone going off to, how about Mars? They're talking about sending a human to Mars. What would that be like to say goodbye to your family and to planet Earth and to all your friends, because they will not see him again because it takes so long for him to get there. And so what he's doing is telling people, don't stop at Ephesus, go further south. So now let's take a look at the text itself of chapter 20. And you can see it's divided into several sections here. So let's take a quick look at the sessions. A return to Troas, okay, which is over on the Asia Minor section. Eutychus is restored to life. Then they go to Miletus, and then Paul gives his farewell speech. And then what we're going to get as we continue on verses 24 down to 38 is we're going to get the further examination of what happens with Paul as he says goodbye. And so let's start to read here. Journey to Macedonia and Greece. They set out to Macedonia. They traveled through regions. He provided many words of encouragement for them. Then he arrived in Greece, stayed there 3 months. But when a plot was made against him by the Jews as he was about to sail for Syria, he decided to return by way of Macedonia. And so he does that. He walks up to Macedonia. He's going to walk across there by himself. A small group will be with him. Sopater, the son of Pyrrhus, I should say, from Berea, accompanied him, as did Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus from Asia. Now notice this, 8 of them are in Paul's little tight group, and there probably were others too, but these are the ones that get named. You recall that I've said before that if we added up all the names that Paul comes in contact with, we'd be in the 70s. And so what we have here is, notice where they come from. Berea is a local area, but the Thessalonica, Derbe, that was his first missionary journey. That's where Timothy was, and somebody from Asia. So they went ahead and they waited for us at Troas. Notice that us there, see, and when you see that, it's a beloved word there, us or we, because it means that Luke the writer is in on this. So anyway, we sailed from Philippi. Well, actually, from the port there, Neapolis, after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now that's the Passover, see, and rejoined them 5 days later in Troas, where we spent a week. And there is a plot that is afoot in Luke chapter 22:1. Remember, he's the writer of the gospel and also is the writer of this great story, the Acts. And there is a plot for the death of Jesus. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 6, they plotted Jesus' death right from the very beginning, right, very opening weeks of his ministry. So now let's take the next section, which is this Eutychus, restored to life. Why would they spend so much time on this? Well, first of all, because there's a man who died. And secondly, there actually is beyond that, beyond having death, it is that he is brought back to life. And not only that, but he has kind of a model of this, both with Elijah and Elisha. So what happens here then? Let's continue. So Paul kept speaking on and on and on until midnight. People here tell me my homilies are too long. So I guess that, this is the same thing happened with Paul. So anyway, he was sitting on the window cell and he fell asleep, and then 3 floors down and cracks himself open and is dead. So Paul threw himself upon him, and as he embraced him, don't be alarmed, there is life in him. See, I put down there, remember Elijah and Elisha. And remember Peter when he brings Tabitha in Joppa in a similar way, that she was the person of great imitation. You could see that she was a saint and people would love to be like her. And here now she has died, but she was brought back to life. So anyway, that we can go to the Elijah or Elisha cycle to find out this. So then he goes back upstairs. They break bread and then eat. Sometimes they ate first and then broke the bread, because broken bread is a euphemism for having the Eucharist. So he fell down from the 3rd floor. He was picked up dead, and then now he is alive. So they took the boy away alive and were immeasurably comforted. This is a daybreak. Now let's take a look at the next section, journey to Miletus. Now Miletus, if you're looking at your map, is a town that is south of Ephesus. And so what happens is the people from Ephesus, they counted, which would be like the city council and all the other kind of people that were in a form of leadership, either by civic or by religious dimensions. So anyway, so we went ahead to the ship and set sail for Assos. We picked up Paul. When he met us in Assos, we took him aboard. He went to Mytilene. And then from there, we set away from the sea on the next day, reached port of Chios. And a day later, we reached Samos. And on the following day, we arrived at Miletus. So anyway, you can see what's happening here is they're making little hops because one ship might have decided to pull in to deliver something, and then Paul had to get off and get on another boat. That's one possibility. Or the other one is that these boats themselves were taking things like letters and packages and other things and just dropping them off. So you say, well, did they have a post office and stamps and all that? Well, no, but they had people that did this for a living. just like you might find somebody who would be accompany you on a journey. So let's take a look at the next one then, Paul's farewell speech at Miletus. Now this goes for some considerable amount of play here, about 20 some verses. And so anyway, if you walk to Miletus, it's going to be about 40 miles, and it's not on Roman roads all the way, that just go straight. No, this, or you could go by sea, and that way you would get there faster. So anyway, he says, you know how long I lived among you the whole time from the day I first came to the province of Asia. So these priests of the church of Ephesus came to Paul, and he tells them, I've been with you all this time, and how I lived with you. Here's where it starts to get heartbreaking. He served the Lord with all humility, with tears and trials that came to me because of the plots of the Jews, and I did not at all shrink from telling you what was for your benefit, or from teaching you in public or in your homes. And I put on the right-hand side the way the Latin people would do it, apologia pro vita sua. He was telling them, an apology is not asking for forgiveness. It is an outline of the virtue that you have as a person. And this is what Paul is doing. He's kind of going over it again, just like a teacher at the end of the year might say, remember when you came in as a freshman back some years ago, and we started you off in September, and now here it is January of your senior year, and you're getting ready for the prom and for other type things. And so the idea that you would have a kind of a plan already to say goodbye by reviewing kind of your life thing, taking your video and rewinding it. So I not at all shrink from telling you what was for your benefit, or from teaching you in public or in your home. See, Paul is saying, he's avowing the truth and interest he had in telling the truth. He says, I earnestly bore witness for both Jews and Greeks to repentance and to faith in our Lord Jesus. But now, compelled by the Spirit, well, you might just as well underline that 10 times over, have it blink every time we come across that page. Compelled by the Spirit. Everything is compelled by the Spirit. It guides us. It leads us. It brings us to a conclusion. It says, I'm going to Jerusalem. What will happen there, I don't know. Well, he's been told and hinted at over and over again that what's going to happen to him is that he will not be with them for long. Except that in one city after another, the Holy Spirit has been warning me that imprisonment and hardships await me. That's what happens in Rome. He has both a kind of a thing like putting a little meter on your ankle or something like that. He can take off and go to see places. Other times he is there with a guard on him, and he can himself have visitors and friends and things like that in. And the worst of it all has been that when he gets the hardship of going to the Mamertine prison, which is the prison that you would go there before death. So let's continue here. And notice this thinking of Paul. He is so sincere with this. He really means it. This is not like a quick jammering about life. No, he says, when I consider life of no importance to me, if only I may finish my course and the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus, to bear witness to the gospel of God's grace. Does that echo with you when you start to read Paul's letter to Timothy? I finished the course. I ran the race. I won the victory. And that's what he's talking about here. He says, now I know that none of you to whom I preach the kingdom during my travels will ever see my face again. And I so solemnly declare to you this day that I am not responsible for the blood of any of you. In other words, you are on your own now. And it's not for me that is going to be father, uncle, or brother to you. It is now just as Peter and the apostles were given the authority by Jesus. Go to Matthew's Gospel 28:18-20. Jesus saying it over again. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, and I give it now to you. So what Paul is saying is something similar to that, based on that. What I have to say, I have given to you, and now it is yours to take over my vision on life, my courage, and my diminishment of self and grandeur of God's place in my heart. I did not shrink from proclaiming to you the entire plan of God. Keep watch over yourselves and over the whole flock of which the Holy Spirit has appointed you overseers, in which you tend the church of God that he acquired with his own blood. This is a remarkable statement and should be an echo in every single Catholic or Christian from that point to the end of time. In other words, you and I should have this in our souls, that after this whole flock has been appointed, then the church of God that Jesus acquired with his own blood is given to our control. Know that my departure, savage wolves will come among you. They will not spare the flock. See, if you're going to use this image of identification, as I mentioned to you in the Gospel of John, for example, Jesus is the good shepherd, and so there's the sheep. Also in the Gospel of John, I am the vine, you are the branches. So we have that kind of attachment that is not like I'm a grape. No, I am the branch. So I cause the grape. So these are the type images that are being used here. Paul picks up on this one. From your own group, men will come forward, perverting the truth to draw the disciples away after them. Now, this is the truth. The early church, we don't know enough about this in our program, but there certainly is enough available for people to know that there are kind of messing up the message because of the fact that, and you can understand this, if this is oral tradition and the passing on as oral, even though they have great memories, some people will adjust it to themselves. For example, the Arians will say, no, well, Jesus can't be a God and man at the same time. That just doesn't fly. And so for them, they have now a heretical nature. It doesn't mean that they despise Jesus or anything like that, or go out after him or to do anything. No, that's not their point. That is, for the early church in the first hundreds of years is challenged and greatly. And there are a whole series of great thinkers. One of the nice things about Pope Benedict, when he was in charge, is that he was a professor, and so he could sit down and write out a book about all the peoples that afflicted the church, or all the peoples who heroically saved the church. So he would have a book that was on the scholars, on the great teachers. He would also have one on those who were the doctors of the church. Such an approbation was given to them quite later, and so I unceasingly so be vigilant. And remember that for 3 years, night and day, I unceasingly admonished each of you with tears. Oh, see, he doesn't say, I admonished you with a barrage of, you nincompoop, you haven't really kind of got the message and stuff. Do I have to shake you to get you to pay attention to what I'm saying? All that kind of stuff. No, he admonished them with tears. Now I command you to God, and that gracious word of his that can build you up and give you the inheritance among all who are consecrated. This type of sentence will be remembered by each and every one of these early Christian peoples. Even the other apostles will be in their heart and on their mind for the rest of their lives. These are the singular important things that have come across. I commend you to God that you can build up the inheritance. That's exactly what he's saying. He's that you now I give over to the good Lord. Remember in the Gospel of John, Jesus says exactly that. He says, you will love, as Peter is finding out, you will love me to the point of death. You will love me because I love you. And in chapters 14 or so, and finally in chapter 21, we get the love that God expresses in Jesus for each and every one of us. And I have never wanted anyone's silver or gold or clothing. Remember, that same statement came from Peter. Are there certain kind of things that are balancing here, for Peter and Paul? Yes, well, Peter does heals a person from death, and Paul does the same thing. Says, well, these very hands have served my needs and my companions. So in other words, he takes up his hands, these are the things that write. And but Paul only wrote his signature and maybe a sentence or two, because the rest was written by scribes. He says, I've never wanted anyone else's. He says, well that these very hands serve my needs and my companions. In every way I've shown you that by hard work of that sort, we must help the weak. See, in other words, what he's doing by his leather working and making satchels or saddles or whatever, taking skins of goats and making of them great large tents like domes that rain can pour off. And all of this back at Corinth, because of the games that were there and the crowds coming in and out every day. It's like being in downtown, since we're in the Midwest, to downtown Chicago, and people were coming in from O'Hare Airport or from other places from the north, from Milwaukee, from Canada, coming back down around Michigan and coming then up into Chicago. It says, in every way I've shown you that this is what I've done. It's more blessed to give than to receive, quoting Jesus. When he finished speaking, he knelt down and prayed with them all. They were all weeping loudly as they threw their arms around Paul and kissed him, for they were deeply distressed that he had said they would never see his face again. Then they escorted him to the ship. And so what we get here is see Peter, 1 Peter chapter 5, because at the end of the first century, we have a church that is structural. It has bishops, it has priests, it has deacons, perhaps deaconesses in certain cases under concern or questions at the moment, all of these things. So now what I could do is this, because we've kind of read through this. And again, I'm sorry, I can't stretch it out for you. Kind of like to distill it. So what I'd like to do is to go back to these questions that we have. Chapter 20. As he traveled throughout these regions, Paul provided many words of encouragement for them. So, what words of encouragement do you find in this chapter? Well, didn't we come across just some of these? Didn't it say just exactly that? Well, let me give you. He says, for 3 years, night and day, I unceasingly admonished each of you with tears. Don't you think that's encouragement? So what words of encouragement do you find in this chapter? Well, I just found one for you. Are you familiar with other encouraging words spoken or written by Paul in his letter? He is all over the place. What other stories from Scripture are brought to mind by Paul's raising of Eutychus? What do you find to be significant about this story? Well, I find this, if you're Eutychus, you say, well, I'm glad the story had a good ending, which is I get up and walk around again, as opposed to being, flapping out of a window. And so and don't be saying, well, it's his own fault because he fell asleep during the Great Apostles lecture. Could you imagine if we were there at that time and we're listening to Paul? Would we know the immensity of this man and what he's done? Would we not be just in absolute awe of him? There's been enough talk of these last days about Abraham Lincoln not deserving our respect because of the fact he didn't do everything that everybody should have done. But if he had the chance, if they didn't shoot him dead, he would have had a chance to keep off the group that decided that they were not going to pay attention to what Abraham Lincoln brought, which was that the slaves were going to be given plots of land, given respect, given kind of a new life, a new way of life, and instead this other group that opposed him all the way up until the present day, or up until Roosevelt. They really, because when you see those movies, or shots of being down south in the film, the reporting film, of dogs jumping on people, of hosing them down, of this, that, the other thing, beating them, kicking them. So anyway, Paul's farewell speech is sums up kind of like what happened with Eutychus, because he's going to leave them, but he's going to leave him alive. What does Paul's farewell speech to the Ephesian elders have in common with Jesus' farewell speech for the disciples at the Last Supper? Well, I know this. How about this? I gave you the quotation, go to Luke 22. But how about this? Do this in memory of me. Do this in memory of me. Talking about the Eucharist. So what Jesus is doing at the Last Supper is he's taking, and notice his forgiveness at the Last Supper. In Luke's gospel, the others, Peter tells 3 times over later on that he doesn't know Jesus, he even swears to it. Well, in Luke, here's how he phrases it. Luke says, Peter, I know you're going to fail me, but when you kind of regain your maturity, he says, then take care of your brothers. So what he does is he's not blaming Peter for anything. What he's saying to them is, it's going to happen, and I'm going to tell you, and you're going to be broken. And so when that happens, what you have to do then is taking care of your brothers and be a kind of a salve for them so that they can regain their structure and their goodness. And so these are possibilities. How does the content of Paul's speech to the elders compare with letters associated with Paul? And I put down, see 1 Corinthians 4 or 9, 6 to 12, or Philemon and or Timothy. The wonder of this attitude of Paul has to be helpful to us, because there he doesn't tell you much about his physical work. He just alludes to it, or his traveling. He just mentions it as if a commonplace. But these letters are the heart of what Paul thinks about Jesus, especially the Gospel of the Romans, the most difficult of the books of the New Testament, along with Revelation. And so Paul's themes of the magnificence of these statements that Paul makes, and then writes it down for them to keep track of. So now, with that in mind, I'm going to move on. I hope you feel okay with what we're doing here today. It could be that I'm going to be able to get back here on time, but I have to be in some place of healing, and I don't know when I'm going to be able to get back directly. Okay, now that's chapter 20. Now we're going to read chapter 21. Yes, you're right. It's right on the heels of chapter 20. Yes, well, we're all together. And you'll notice that this has some 40 verses. So it's somewhat similar to Acts 20. And once again, I enjoin you to understand that what we're getting here is the underlying thing is what's going to happen with Paul. The overlying thing is that Paul is going to have experiences here, and it's not going to be where he is writing letters or sharing his faith with us or sharing his understanding of Jesus or other type things. Instead, what was going to happen is that we are going to accompany Paul as he goes through his journey. I would suggest, I haven't read this type of thing, that part of the underlying statements of what Paul goes through, even though he's on the water and he crashes and all that kind of things, is that there's kind of a somewhat vague illusion that Paul is himself following the experience that Jesus followed as he comes to the place where he should be adored in a temple area, and instead is considered to be a brigand, and he is captured at the middle of the night and put into jail and put into trials. And if you go to the trials before, first of all, before the Jewish leaders, you will find several dozen, I'm talking dozen, things that are improper in this trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin and the high priests. I say high priest because Annas still kind of holds control over that, even though his son-in-law is the real high priest for that year. Remember how that happened in John's gospel, where it said just that. He says, and then the great person of power was not Annas, but it was Caiaphas. And it says Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. That year, he's a high priest. How about Jesus, the high priest for eternity, praying for us? He prays for us. And so what we get here is something of overwhelming spirituality. So we can apply that to Paul. There's a kind of a trail of difficulty and challenge. And even though we know the answer, how desperately we hope that Paul is going to be safe. So anyway, let's continue to read now. Most of the last half dozen years of Paul's life, roughly about in the late 50s to the middle 60s, is recounted in the Acts from 21 to 28. So that means that this really does get us down to the last kind of material on the of our text, because of the fact that 28 is going to end the program for us. It confirmed that Paul brought donation money to Jerusalem. See, now that was one of the things why he did want to go to Jerusalem, was as he had done before, and others had done before too, and that was that he brings a collection for the Jewish and not the Gentile, but the Jewish leader followers of Jesus as they suffer under the difficulty of getting money from the temple, etc., because they joined with Jesus. So anyway, when we left Miletus. Paul makes several stops, meaning that you take the ship most likely to get you closer to your desired destination. So they stopped at Kos, at Rhodes. Remember, we've talked about that, the great Colossus at Rhodes, that great huge giant of a person at the edge of the area that was roped off for ships to come in to unload their materials and other things that they had brought with them, or to load up their materials, as commonly mentioned several times. It really isn't that there you can just get out there and sail on the Mediterranean. It was the majority of the time you could not travel, or you should not have traveled. I says, so I mentioned also, this wonder of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They stayed with disciples for a week and then had a parade of believers kneeling on the beach to pray for safety. This is kind of almost like last January, if you go on, even on a very stormy and cold and bitter day, and find people outside the Supreme Court building with signs, we are pro-life, let live, and all of those type things, and some wags over in the corners too, they're ripping them apart and stuff like that because of this taking away of their liberties. As you know, the scientific creation of humankind is at the very moment of conception. From that point on, if everything just goes along to the regular things of growth, inside of that little tiny dot are your ears and your legs and your thoughts and your liver and all the things that make you, the ability to breathe and eat and survive and to propagate. All of this was there right from the very beginning. And so to be taking that and throwing it away seems to be taking something of God away, a God who created us. So anyway, they stayed with the disciples week, then in the parade. The next leg of the journey took them to Ptolemais, staying with the brothers for a day. That would be a joy for them anyway, for Paul to pull into town, and then all of a sudden you sit down and sit around the table and have a big discussion. These discussions could go on for all day long. And the next day they landed at Caesarea, where they went to the house of Philip, the evangelist, who was one of the 7. Now remember this because he comes up several times now in the Acts. And so that group was the choice of the apostle to maintain the charitable tasks of sharing food and wisdom with those needing charity. Remember how they said that. However, it turns out Stephen and Philip, who were Hellenists, became engaged with preaching and catechetical activities. Stephen goes to his death because of that, and Philip converts a man from the Queen of Sheba's realm down in central and southern, or I should say, more central and over to the right-hand side, maybe with modern-day Ethiopia. The others were designed to keep records and not be tied down with table service. The laying on of hand gives hints of ordination to the diaconate. Now, we've come across this guy before, Agabus. Remember, he had a prophetic example. Appears from Jerusalem and gives a prophetic example of Paul being tied up and handed over to the Gentiles. Paul sees himself as imitating Jesus, moving on the way to Jerusalem from his homeland to the cross. So what he's going to do then is taking the way of Jesus to the cross is going to be kind of the mantra for all human life, is that we are leaving the homeland of our own security and walking with the cross to our, you say execution? No, to our movement into the heavenly kingdom. If you go to the Gospel of Mark, the very center section of the triptych tells us 3 times over that Jesus is going to die, but people don't buy into that. But Jesus does that. So what's the point of Mark organizing his gospel in that fashion, so that you have 3 times over statements by Jesus that he's going to suffer and die? Because that's exactly what he wants us to do, leaving behind the trappings of ourself and giving it to the beneficiary of others. Because as Thomas Merton has said, and we've quoted before, there are 2 things in life only. One is to realize that we are a gift. We are a gift from God. We don't have to be here. We are a gift. And then secondly is we're not a gift unless we give of ourselves to someone else. And so what our work might be is precisely to be a person on the alert to sharing all the beauty and wonder of our life with others and for others, even if it costs us our life. And so we continue. It turns out that the Philip became engaged with preaching, catechetical activities. The others were designated to keep the records and not be tied down with table service. So that's so much for what the deacons were supposed to be doing, and that's what they ended up doing. The laying on of hands gives ordination to the diaconate. Now that is a part of a little bit of a problem of whether or not we should have female people as deacons, deaconesses. That is way too large an issue to get into, but I am thoroughly prepared to do so any other time when you have an afternoon off. Agabus appears from Jerusalem. It gives a prophetic example, Paul being taken away. Paul sees himself as imitating Jesus moving on the way. And remember the Bartimaeus in Mark chapter 10. And he followed Jesus on the way. The very thing that the disciples are supposed to do in that middle passage when their journey to Jerusalem, but this man follows Jesus on the way. So what you're doing is you're imagining Jesus climbing the ascent up to the holy mountain of Jerusalem. And it is that's where theophanies take place, on the top of these mountains. Jesus calls up there, and behind him, if you can put it this way, about maybe 10 feet to 10 yards or whatever, and you have a slow kind of walk behind him up through kind of difficult. It's not like there's big roads going up there, where things like that. It's a difficult situation here, and because you're climbing up in effect from the lowest spot of the earth to one of the highest spots around the southern part of Israel. So the party moves towards Jerusalem to be welcomed by the brothers, especially James and the presbyters. James is the brother of the Lord, and we know what that means, a relative, and the head of the Jerusalem Christians. So James runs the community there. So Paul is told to behave. His encounter is tense at the same time that on the surface he kind of hides that. See, why is he tense? Because of the fact that these are the very people that he'd gone after. So he gives a long speech of self-defense in Hebrew. Well, really Aramaic. Hebrew was more or less sent for worship. He didn't talk in that because it's thee and thou type of stuff that you would have for worship and talking about God. Eventually, Paul was given a 3-point plan. First, stay with the Hellenistic Jewish believer named Nasan or Cyprian. A private meeting, secondly, with all the elders of the various Jewish congregations. So first you meet with the Hellenistic Jewish believer, Cyprian, and then with the elders of the various Jewish congregations, and then join 4 local believers in fulfilling a Nazarite vow associated with the temple. It was a ruse thinking Paul would not accede, but he did. Situation was, when in Jerusalem, do what the Jerusalemites do, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So that's how to read this. Now, let's take a look at the actual text. And when you take a look at the text, here's what you see. You see arrival at Tyre, arrival at Ptolemais in Caesarea, arrival in Jerusalem, and Paul's arrest. So we do know now, just by the quick overview, that that's going to happen to Paul. Doesn't mean he's going to be executed right then and there, not really. And so what we have here now is the arrival at Tyre. Remember, Tyre is part of us, and Sidon, where, remember the Syro-Phoenician woman? That's where she came from. Her mother was an evil, evil woman. So when and the father was no better. Remember, they were in on the thing of trying to deal with Elijah. So that was back then. That was some 500 plus years before Christ. So when we had taken leave of them, we set sail, made a straight run for Kos, and on the next day for Rhodes, and from there to Patara. A straight run. Usually, some of these times, what you had to do was you had to go in one direction and then go to another direction. So you're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in order to make progress ahead of time. In other words, your ship can move through sideways, but it cannot move straight ahead. Finding a ship crossing to Phoenicia, we went on board and put out to sea. We caught sight of Cyprus. Now, yeah, I remember how Barnabas and Mark, that was Barnabas's domain, and Mark was a fellow. He was actually I'm trying to think that whether or not he wasn't given any kind of a write-up before and stuff like that. It just mentioned that he was a cousin, and that was it. So we caught sight of Cyprus, and we went on towards Syria, which of course is the northern coast there up near Antioch. We put in a Tyre, where the shipload, that's southern Lebanon nowadays. There we sought out the disciples and stayed for a week. They kept telling Paul through the Spirit not to embark for Jerusalem. So Paul has this choice to make. Do I stay in safety with the brothers and maybe hide if they find that necessary? Or is there a goal for me beyond this that God has in mind for me? And don't go to Jerusalem. Why? Well, remember what happened to Stephen. And you, Paul, stood there and you saw what happened to Stephen because you were holding their coats for him. Yes, Paul, you saw that. So you should agree with us right offhand that this is a murderous time. And but Paul says, no, my choice is to God. And the only thing that they don't put here that we know full well is that the source of all this is the Holy Spirit. So at the end of their stay, they resumed their journey, all of them, women and children included, escorted us out of the city. See, we think that this is androgenic, that we're only talking about men when we talk about the apostles, but that's not the case. There are women for part of this journey. We certainly know Mary Magdalene, and we find Mary of Clopas and others, that came across that. So after kneeling on the beach to pray, we bade farewell to one another. Then we boarded the ship and they returned home. Now, when I was the principal at Mount Carmel, I arranged for a class that I had that had two periods. One was literature and philosophy, and the other was the Gospel of John. And then we actually merged the two. So all the literature that we read for philosophy or for literature merged with the Gospel of John. For example, we had an imitation of the fact that in John's Gospel, a blind man was given a mud pack on his eyes. So because I could arrange the schedule for these two students to be right at the middle of the day and also right next to lunch period. So what we would do is we would take in the fall and the spring is we would get parents' permission, and we would jump into our cars and we go over to the promontory, which sticks out from where the Museum of Science and Industry is, and there we would do some of our stuff. Well, for example, when we read about Judas going out into the night, we read the whole book of Elie Wiesel, The Night, talking about the Holocaust. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, when I saw wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. The smoke was the bodies of children being put into the incinerators that they had, two to a tray, a great big long tray of metal, red hot, and then the body would be put in there and shoved in there. And about 25 minutes later, they would pull out, and all it turned out to be was dust left with a high amount of potash, which was put in bags and given to farmers for helping their crops, kind of like a manure. So anyway, the part that we continue about this is that at the end of the journey, we left and resumed our journey. Women and children, including, escorted us out of the city, kneeling on the beach to pray. So as part of the things that we did in this whole program that I was talking about is we spent our two periods and our lunch period out there and then get back home to the school and, get back to work and stuff like that. But we, on occasion, this is exactly what we do, is that we would have a kneeling session on one of the beaches down below to pray, kind of a biblical thing. I remember because we, at one time, we used to, well, several times, we got up very early in the darkness and waited for the Easter sunrise. And then we would light the fire and have Mass right there on the shoreline of Lake Michigan. One time, the snow there had frozen over and still bitter cold out. And but we were there with our jackets on and we were ready to light the fire and stuff. But when the sun came up, it came across all the ice that was in front of us in the snow and it turned orange, just like an orange popsicle. So there you are, kind of orange popsicle. And so the whole front of us was orange and it gave a very mysterious thing. It's almost like the sun had given up its proper place in the heavens and came down and then put a lit right there on the shore of Lake Erie. How about that? So anyway, now they arrived at Ptolemais and Caesarea. So we continued the voyage. It came to Ptolemais, where we greeted the brothers, stayed a day with them. And the next day we resumed the trip and came to Caesarea. See, remember before the last session, we were talking about encouragement. Well, this is what's happening here. This is encouragement. Paul stops for a day to be sure he doesn't take a day off or say this is too much. We got other things to do. No, everybody needs to be seen. So, and then they now they find Philip the evangelist again, who was one of the seven, stayed with him. He had 4 virgin daughters gifted with prophecy, passing on a heritage. Now there was a ritual act which is not well known, but there is a ritual in Jewish alignment of your future that you could make a commitment to virginity. The women could and give that over to God, give your reproductive rights over to God because you wanted to be for God alone. That was their thing that was possible for them. I don't know if you knew that or not. We'd been there several days when a prophet named Agabus came from Judea. He took Paul's belt, bound his own feet and hands with it, and said, "This is the Holy Spirit talking. This is the way the Jews will bind the owner of this belt. In Jerusalem, they will hand him over to the Gentiles." See, a prophetic example. They don't walk Paul down to the beach, under an umbrella, and drinking some lemonade. No, it's a prisoner. When we heard this, and we and the local residents begged him not to go up to Jerusalem, then Paul said, "What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? I'm prepared not only to be bound, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." Since he would not be dissuaded, we let the matter rest, saying, "The Lord's will be done." See, anyway, this is an imitation of Jesus' march to Jerusalem. And the geography of the Gospels is very simple. It is a single journey, a single pilgrimage. That's what Jesus does. The first third of the Gospel of Mark is he does his ministry. Second is that he makes the journey to Jerusalem. And the third is that his journey to Jerusalem puts him up on the cross. So that is the geology and also the theology and the spirituality of Jesus as recorded in this remarkable document of the first gospel. He invented the gospel text and how it is put together. So let's continue. Paul and James in Jerusalem. So anyway, we made preparation for our journey. Then we went up to Jerusalem. See, up there in Caesarea. This is some 65 miles I put down there, I think. I did, yes. I will be there this summer in June. Yes, I will think of you. Yes. Will you think of me? No. So anyway, they came to the house of Mnason, a Cypriot from Cyprus, disciple of long standing with whom we were to stay. So when we reached Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul accompanied us on a visit to James, and all the presbyters were present. Wow, quite a gathering this must be. And when they say that the presbyterate is there, they say, well, who is going to be the one to say the Mass? And most likely it is the bishop, so it would be one of the apostles. And then Paul tells everybody there, this is what happened in detail. what God had accomplished among the Gentiles through his ministry. So, wow. Then I put on the left-hand side, we ends, he no longer uses that till about 2 years go by. So anyway, he greeted them, proceeded to tell them the details. So they praised God when they heard it, but said to him, brother, you see how many thousands of believers there are from among the Jews, and they're all zealous observers of the law. Isn't this wow? And the Holy Spirit is certainly present there. Remember, at the Pentecost, there were thousands of converts. They had been informed that you are teaching all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to abandon Moses. See, now this is where the lies come in. This is where the good old American fibs, as instead of the news, tells us all kind of stuff that is off track. So anyway, so here we are. The teaching, they bend the truth. They could have been talking about the fact that Jesus is similar to Moses, a development of Moses. Moses was the prelude to Jesus. There's 20 different ways in which Moses is a predecessor to Jesus, yes. But anyway, what they're turning that out to is to say that they're telling to abandon Moses, and that they're telling them not to circumcise their children. In other words, they're not paying attention to the law. And so what is to be done? They will surely hear what you have arrived. So what do we tell you? We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take these men and purifying with them and pay their expenses. They may have their head shaved. So in other words, what he's got is these people, four guys who were part of his retinue, and they're going to go down to the temple dressed as and cut as Nazarites, and say, well, yeah, but we're friends of Paul. You say, oh, okay, he really is. That's like being a person who spends his time and in concern outside of his work and family to be with Jesus all the time. So what do we tell you? We have 4 men who have taken a vow. In this way, everyone will know that there is nothing to the reports that have been given about you, Paul, but that you yourself live in observance of the law. See. Anyway, let's continue by turning the page. Yes, I'll give you time to turn the page. Yes, time is over. Now, as for the Gentiles who have come to believe, we sent them our decision. They abstained from meat. So remember, this was the council, the first council of the church, where they made these decisions on a compromise. That the Greeks could abstain from eating meat sacrificed to idols. They could refrain from drinking from blood. They also from the meat of strangled animals. They had to be cut through the neck. And from unlawful marriage, especially marrying somebody who might be in your family, incest or whatever. These things happen, as we find out in Corinthians. So then Paul's arrest. So when the 7 days were nearly completed, the Jews from the province of Asia noticed him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd, laid hands on him. See, in other words, Paul doesn't belong in here. Paul doesn't belong in here because he tried to capture Christians and bring them in, and then gave up on that and became a Christian himself. And so a lot of these Jews that are here are from the diaspora. That is, in other words, they come to Jerusalem precisely to go into the temple because their synagogue doesn't match that. And so this is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place. And what is more, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this sacred place. So there's a big sign over the door there saying, if you are not a Jew, then you are coming in here under the penalty of death. So the diaspora Jews who made this long trip to be there and all of a sudden find out Greeks walking around. He says, so for they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and suppose that Paul had brought him into the temple. You might remember that in John chapter 12, that there are a group of Greeks who come to Jesus as he is in Jerusalem and ask him about questions about the afterlife, etc. And so these Greeks wanted to actually be close to Jesus and close to his spirit. So this was kind of reflected in this particular element that Paul brings up. So let's continue. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian there. The whole city was in turmoil with people rushing together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple. How ironic, I put down there. Paul, who was the major figure of the temple life, and now all of a sudden he's dragged out. Immediately the gates were closed. While they're trying to kill him, a report reached the cohort commander that all Jerusalem was rioting. They immediately took soldiers and centurions and charged down on them. When they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. I put down there that, a legion is 10,000 soldiers, which means that a cohort commander would have 1,000. But here, since you're in the far east here, I should say Asia Minor, where you don't need all this kind of stuff, they were down to 600. And most of these were Syrians. So these were not spaghetti eating Italians. They were people who were kind of grabbed by the Roman soldiers and made into soldiers so they could fill out their numbers. Remember when the great feast days are here, especially like Pentecost and the others, or especially Passover, there would be these cohorts would come down, either on horseback or mainly walking. The cohort commander came forward, arrested him, and ordered him to be secured with 2 chains. That's kind of ironic because before he had been chained, as Peter was chained, and so he tried to find out who he might be, what he had done. Some in the mob shouted one thing, others something else. So since he was unable to ascertain the truth because of the uproar, he ordered Paul to be brought into the compound. So, these are little historical tidbits, and we're supposed to kind of read into them to find out what's going on. So what you've got so far is like a downtown riot going on with people going out all over the place, trying to be sure to alert everybody that, hey, there's trouble down here. Come on down and join us. And so anyway, what the soldiers are trying to do is trying to keep peace. So as we heard last night, don't defund the police, fund the police. When he reached the steps, he was carried by soldiers because of the violence of the mob. He was carried, so they were going to knock over the soldiers and pound Paul. Just as Paul was about to be taken into the compound, he said to the cohort commander, "May I say something to you?" He says, "Yeah." He replied, "Do you speak Greek? So then you're not the Egyptian who started a revolt some time ago and led the 4,000 assassins into the desert." So this is the cohort commander. He says to Paul, says, "Do you speak Greek?" So then you're not. He said, "Yes." So you're not Egyptians who started a revolt, because if he answered in Egyptian, why then there'd be trouble. Paul says, "I'm a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, that southeastern part of Turkey, a citizen of no mean city." It was one of the great cities of culture that around the Mediterranean. "I request you to permit me to speak to the people." When he given his permission to the people, when all was quiet, he addressed them in Hebrew. So there we are. Josephus says that the revolutionaries camped out on Mount of Olives. Now, since we did that, let's see if we can go back to our questions here and see if we can put together some reply. Let's go back to chapter 21. This is the previous pages. You see where it says discussion prompts for chapters 20 and 21. Yes, you are. Okay, you're right there. I'm going to put mine back in. Okay, there we go. Now we put it there. Now, let's see, chapter 21. Knowing that the Spirit is compelling him to go to Jerusalem, how does Paul respond to those who try to convince him not to go? Well, it's very easy for us to answer that without even looking at the material. The Holy Spirit has told him to do that. We met Agabus before in Acts, and remember what that was all about? There was going to be a great famine, and that they up in the north could really gain some access to some friendship if they sent something down to the Jews who were in Jerusalem. So the Gentile followers of Jesus up in the north were going to send down to the Jewish followers of Jesus some money and some coins and some other type things, perhaps even grain and other stuff to be able to feed them and take care of them. It says, what problem did the Christian leaders in Jerusalem anticipate because of Paul's coming? Well, because of the fact that them too then will be included in the whole process. What practical action did they recommend? Getting rid of Paul. Why did the Jews riot? Why did the cohort commander arrest Paul? What's at the heart of the conflict that we read about in this chapter? The conflict is this, that you have a new and complete understanding of God's plan for the universe by bringing us Jesus into our lives, and that Jesus now has been put to death on the cross, and taught us an immense amount of material on how to live and what the goal for life should be. And all of this is not in violation of what Paul knew or the other Jews knew, but it was a affirmation that the Messiah is here, that the person of Jesus is God with us, and that what you're doing with maintaining your religiosity of Judaism is you're not completing the growth into like a branch off of a sapling. You're not growing into the growth off of what Judaism was, which was the stem, the kind of sticking up out of the ground, and then from that comes a little flower, and then that flower starts to grow and grow and grow. By the year 400, there will be approximately 4 million Christians in the Mediterranean. So we're talking some big action here. Now, if you have any questions, keep them, because I probably won't be there. And so I hope that doesn't twist your soul or your mind or trap you into moments of desperation. Instead, I'm reporting back to you again that these materials that we're reading now really have an element of a very carefully arranged history, because he doesn't tell you extraneous things or things that are unimportant. But he does give you a good sense that there are all these small cities that are being visited. Why is that? Because it's necessary to know that Paul is the one who gives out of his life and his energy the love of all of God's people. So that's the way it goes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to quietly close the book. And I'm going to wish you well. As you can see, that the next time that we get together, we will have another 2 chapters, because we have to be doubling up now so that we can complete our program in time. You can see that March 10th, chapters 22 and 23, and then March 24th, chapters 24 and 25, and then March 31, chapters 26, 27, and 28. So we're getting closer and closer and closer. So there's plenty of action coming up. Keep yourself on the edge of your seat. And I thank you. So I'm now going to leave here, and I'm going to find out how to turn off this particular presentation. And in doing so, I hope everything comes across well. You're very kind and patient to be able to listen to my talk about these particular things. Thank you.
Oh dear. Okay, thank you for watching.